Hi, I'm Benton Stokes,
And I'm Elaine O'Rourke.
and this is Cocktail Theology.
Here we are.
Hi.
It is a Friday morning in the northern hemisphere on our side of the world.
It is. It's a beautiful morning, actually.
It is. We are in San Jose, California, which is where the headquarters for School for Seekers has traveled to. Sorry about the dangling preposition, people. And so that's where we are,
That's where we are.
starting all new things.
Yeah. Sorry about the hiatus. It was sort of unavoidable and unexpected, but here we are. We're back.
We are back.
So it's great to be back.
That's it. We do not have cocktails this morning.
We don't. It's a little early for that. I think I've been awake an hour, so so I'm guzzling coffee right now.
And you've just made everyone in our listening audience feel so much better about us by saying it's too early for cocktails, that you've only been awake an hour. I know. Yeah. Last night we talked about when we were going to record. This morning we talked about having Irish coffee, and we both just looked at each other and went, yeah, that's not happening. So instead we're just having regular coffee. Mine has a shot of espresso in it. And I've been up 5 hours, and I'm still drinking espresso.
You're still drinking espresso. Yeah. I hear you.
Anyway, so over the last couple of years, I've noticed there's much more conversation on Twitter, in social media in general, about depression and being Christian.
Yes.
And what that means. So here's what I read this morning. Feelings do not drive our faith. The fact of Jesus' death and resurrection drives our faith. That means that feelings are the fruit of faith, not the source of it. Don't feel your way into beliefs, believe your way into feelings. Now, I think what the author's getting at there is actually really useful. That is, one can be a deep believer in Jesus Christ, and we can talk in another podcast about what that means. Be following Jesus Christ as closely as possible, and still have bad feelings.
Yes.
Or not feel God's presence all the time.
Right.
And I think what this person's trying to say is that we can't judge whether we are on the right path by how we feel about God in any particular moment.
Right.
Okay? The problem is this idea that on your very worst days, your faith should be your refuge and your boast. Your posture should always be one of dependence on it, and that feelings come from assurance. So that once one is assured in one's salvation or whatever, however you're framing that, your feelings will be fine. That's the problem, right?
Right.
Another person I was reading this morning was talking about, she says, in my walk with Christ, I found that such band-aid phrases like Jesus fills the void and be satisfied with God are superficial. They're cute little sayings that claim, do this and everything will be better, as if being a Christian means that once we accept Christ, it's happily ever after and we'll never have to feel empty or restless again. I've had people contact me for counseling who have said they're feeling terrible. That's fine. And they're feeling guilty that they're feeling terrible because since they know God, they shouldn't be feeling terrible anymore.
Right, I've heard that before too.
And I think it's easy to feel that way, to feel like if I'm close to God, God should be filling this void, if there's a void, or God should be satisfying my sticky soul completely. The question I'm asking today is, do my feelings about my daily life accurately reflect my closeness to God? In other words, are my emotions a barometer or a measure of my actual dependence on God? I mean, I've got this scale in mind, right? Where if I've got lots of happiness units, right, that means that I'm very close to God. If I've got a lot of sadness units, that means I am very far from God. I should feel slightly ashamed and slightly guilty, not a lot, about being so far from God. And no matter what, I should be turning to God completely to satisfy that sadness.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
That's the question that I've got. Now, it seems to me patently absurd, but I understand that it doesn't feel absurd to lots and lots of other people. So I want to tease out where the truth in that is and where the falseness is.
Right.
All these crazy thoughts in my head. Why I'm here is anyone's guess. What do I feel? Will it ever be clear?
I was very conscious of this question myself during this move. Because even though I am truly, completely confident that this cross-country move for School for Seekers, my family, for you, for anybody who's doing it, that this cross-country move is absolutely being guided, if not directed, by God. I feel I have no concern about that. I feel like everything has come together in ways that I certainly could not have managed.
Right.
And I've been feeling anxious and stressed. I know people who would critique me for feeling anxious and stressed when I know that God's got this.
Yeah.
Or would say, well, clearly you actually don't believe that God's got this, and that's why you're anxious and stressed.
Yeah, that's malarkey.
Okay, so that was the word I was hunting for, was malarkey.
It was a nicer word than the first word that leapt to mind, but it's malarkey.
Okay, can we play with the good side of that for a moment?
Yeah.
That idea, that truth, and I think this is truth, that our souls are sticky.
Yeah.
Our souls long for absolute unity with God. They will not have absolute unity with God in this life if for no other reason than we are physical creatures.
Right.
And God is a non-physical being. So our souls are sticky. They are looking for the satisfaction that comes with complete unity with God.
Right.
And when they are lacking that, they will stick to other things.
Yes.
So they will stick to alcohol. They'll stick to bad relationships. They'll stick to reading the paper every morning, whatever it is. And it can be bad, good, indifferent. It can be any of those things. But I believe that our souls are sticky and that they are constantly looking, reaching for the unity in God.
I believe that too.
Okay? So that inclines me to believe that it is better for my soul to get lots of God time and lots of God experience than to not do that.
Right.
And that trying to feed my soul existential junk food will not fill that and may cause me to pursue existential junk food much more than I should.
Right.
Than is healthy for me, not should in the moral sense. It's not about God's going to be hurt if I don't come close to God.
Yeah.
God's not going to be hurt.
Yeah.
But it is not good for me to pursue material short-term satisfaction when my soul is hungry for God.
Right.
So I think that the good part of this whole idea is that it reminds me that there is a part of me that just wants to be with God. And that when I make the effort to make the time and attention to have that happen, it is better for every other part of me. When the workings of my spirit are aligned with the workings of the Spirit, it is better for me.
Yes.
Taking that to an extreme, though, would suggest that if I am spending 24/7 completely immersed in the pursuit of God and the closeness of God, then there should never, ever, 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 ever be anything else that goes on for me.
Yeah, if only it worked that way. Because the fact of the matter is, we can pursue God to that extent, to those extremes, and still things will happen that will cause us to feel unhappy, unfulfilled, less than. And it doesn't sometimes even take things to happen for us to feel that way. anybody that deals with depression on any level understands that. Things can be going along swimmingly in every area of your life, and yet if you deal with depression, you still don't have that giddy over the moon feeling.
Right.
This is a dialogue that's happening to varying degrees in the church now, which is good and important. Christians are acknowledging that depression is an actual thing that happens, in some churches more than other churches. But, I was reading on Instagram just a few days ago, there was a pastor out here in California who took his life after preaching the funeral for someone who had taken her own life earlier that day. And this was someone who had started an organization to promote suicide awareness among Christians. And this was someone that had dealt with depression his whole life and suicidal thoughts, who had, a beautiful family, plenty to live for, 29 years old, I think.
He was very young.
Yeah, and yet, crippling depression, suicidal depression happens among Christians. And it doesn't matter whether you know in your head that Jesus is the light of the world. It doesn't matter if you know that God has you in the palm of God's hand. It doesn't matter if you know these things. If you're depressed, if you're suicidal, you're not going to feel giddy and over the moon because you know these things.
Right.
You're not going to feel giddy and over the moon because these things are true.
Right.
Feelings are not a good barometer of faith. I would argue they're not a barometer of faith at all. Sometimes moments that I have felt the furthest away from God are, I suspect, moments that I was closer to God than I've probably been.
Right.
We don't know the mind or the workings of God and the way God moves in and through our lives. And many times when we feel very, very far away is when God is holding us so close. And if God weren't holding us so close, we, who knows what might have happened. But our feelings wouldn't tell us that.
Right. I'm hearing a couple of different things in what you're saying. One is that my own perception of my feelings. That's one. One is how close God is. Whether God is active, whether God is working in my life. And then the one that I think that people actually get hung up on is, am I leaning on God sufficiently?
Right.
Trusting sufficiently, whatever that is. If I only prayed for my schizophrenia to be cured better, more often, correctly, and leaned on God, pterodactyls would go away. Right? I'm not schizophrenic to anyone who's listening to this, but I mean, the idea that since he died by suicide, he may have intellectually known all these things, but really, he either wasn't saved, or he wasn't close enough to God, or he wasn't leaning on God, and whatever that thing is.
Right.
Those things are separable ideas, but that last one, it's insidious and it permeates so much of what we do, both as followers of Jesus, but also just as people in the culture.
Sure.
So, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but when years ago, when I was depressed and I didn't recognize it as depression, people would say things to me like, isn't that adorable? Doesn't that just make you feel so good? And I'd be like, no. I mean, yes, adorable. I can, that cat, if there had been cat videos, it would have been, yes, that cat video, really amusing. Oh, the cat on top of the goat, fantastic.
Just hilarious.
Just hilarious, but I don't feel better.
Right.
Right? There is in our culture, and maybe in other cultures too, this huge stigma about emotional illness.
Yeah.
I'm using emotional illness deliberately here because we're talking about feelings.
Right.
There is such a blame the victim aspect to that, right? It's okay to call in sick if you have the flu. It's not okay to call in sick if you simply cannot get out of bed. right?
Right.
So I wonder how much of this, if only you leaned on Jesus more, you would feel happy and content all the time. It's just another way of saying, yeah, you don't have the flu, get out of bed.
Yeah, it's some of that. And I know that in my own life, I've been guilty of thinking those thoughts too, and thinking, well, I'm doing something wrong. I don't have enough faith, or I don't have enough, gumption to just do what I have to do today.
Right.
And it's only been, in recent years that I've recognized that when depression is a real thing in your life, and it is in many of our lives, it's as real as the flu. Because honestly, if you just blame yourself, all it does is compound the problem. It just makes it all so much worse. Because then things like guilt and shame settle in on top of depression and whatever else you're feeling.
And guilt and shame already feed depression,
Right.
even if you don't have chronic depression.
Right. So yeah, we definitely aren't doing anyone any favors when we insinuate that their faith isn't strong enough when they're dealing with something like depression.
Suppose they're not dealing with depression. Suppose they're dealing with a big move, okay? And that unnamed person in the big move feels anxious, unnamed persons. What do we say about, we'll just talk about me since we're actually talking about me. Even though I'm confident that this move was exactly the right thing to do, blah, 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 God has it, blah, blah, blah. In the daily details of getting things done, anxiety would just rise up.
Yeah.
So what if I were a Jesus follower talking to me? Let's go back to the schizophrenia question. No, but if I were a Jesus follower talking to me, what would I say about that would be incorrect? And what might I say that would be correct or useful?
Well, the incorrect thing would be to say, well, if you really believe that God is all over this move, then you wouldn't feel anxious and stressed like you do.
Okay.
That would be the incorrect thing to say.
And why is it incorrect? Besides not being not being useful.
It just isn't true. I mean, the fact is, a move is stressful. There are 100 details that you're dealing with every day. There are so many, especially a cross-country move, especially when you're trying to sell a home, especially when that home has many, 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 many moving parts. And it's not just you that's doing the moving. It's also your husband and your kid. And you have things to think about like jobs and schools. And I mean, all of it is anxiety-ridden, all of it. So it's completely unrealistic to say that you could go through a move like that and not have anxiety or stress simply because you love Jesus.
And so I want to keep going on that. I had talked a moment ago about soul being sticky, about spirit aligning with Holy Spirit. The fact is that we are also minds, bodies, all these other things. And even if I keep my eyes fixed on Jesus, keep my mind focused on the move, there are aspects of my thinking, aspects of my synapses, aspects of my hormonal system.
Yeah, just how fatigued your body gets with everything
Right.
that you're doing.
Right. And I can think all good thoughts. No one can do this. But I could think all good thoughts all day long about Jesus or about the move. And still, my body would not necessarily respond in that way.
Right.
So I want to just lift up as well that the kinds of feelings we have, although feelings are connected with thoughts, whether they're thoughts we recognize or thoughts we don't, that it's much more complex than that. We are much more layered than that.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too, is that when people say things like, you wouldn't be so anxious if you really trusted, they are really so oversimplifying us as complex people.
Right. We are not just souls in a body.
Right.
As if we can think our way out of the body.
Yeah.
God, I know it's a long way down, but my heart's convinced there's no way out. I've tried to be brave, now I need to be saved.
So if we care about somebody, what could we say to that person when the person starts feeling that way and perhaps doubting his or her own closeness to God. If somebody says to you, I'm feeling anxious all the time, am I still saved? How do you respond? Without just sort of scoffing, giggling a little, and then going back. Would you excuse me a minute while I go laugh and then come back?
And then I'll
Right.
come back. All right. Well, I mean, I would say what we're saying, feelings and faith are not tightly correlated. In the church I was growing up in, we would sometimes talk about mountaintop experiences.
Yes.
And how, you're at church, or you're at a camp meeting or a revival meeting or a camp. And when it ends, you just have this ethereal, just like lifted feeling.
Euphoria.
It's euphoric. And how, that is unsustainable. It's wonderful when it happens. And hopefully through that experience, you gain something that you can grab onto that is like a truth, or something that concretely speaks to you in some meaningful way that is, again, beyond the feelings, because the feelings are quickly going to fade. You're going to be 10 minutes down the road and there's going to be an accident on the freeway, and you're going to sit there for a half an hour, and then all of a sudden the whole mountaintop thing is gone. It's all gone. So feelings can't be trusted. So I think, something useful to say to someone who is in the middle of a life change that's creating some anxiety, or even if it's not a life change, if it's just someone that's dealing with anxiety, pervasive anxiety, well, first of all, if I'm a friend, I'm going to probably ask questions about, have you talked to your doctor? What are you doing in your lifestyle that could be perpetuating or aggravating this? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating well? Are you getting enough exercise? Are you, and just asking those kinds of questions, because again, body, mind, spirit, soul, all of these things are so interconnected. I'm not going to leap to, are you trusting Jesus? That's not where I'm going to go. But I am going to try to help them troubleshoot what are some changes that I could make that might make this easier for me, make this better for me. Talking to your doctor is a big thing. I mean, if anxiety is becoming an overarching theme in your life, then you may need to be on some medication for that. And there's no shame in that. Right. For Christians to be medicated if they have a chemical imbalance that's causing anxiety or depression or whatever.
Right.
Or seeing a therapist.
Right. Or
talking
both.
to someone. Who may or may not be a quote-unquote Christian counselor.
Right. Right.
I mean, so I think taking the shame and the guilt off of that conversation as much as you possibly can, so that the person can look at that outside of right and wrong, or should and shouldn't, and those kinds of things that we put on ourselves, particularly as Christians. And just be able to look at it more objectively apart from that.
Right.
And reminding that person of the things that are foundational to Christian faith, that God loves and accepts them as they are, who they are, where they are. They're not doing anything wrong by feeling this way. God does not condemn us for our feelings.
Right.
Reminding them of things like that.
I hadn't considered this until just now as you were speaking. So imagine the scenario in which someone is going through a tough time for whatever reason. Doesn't feel close to Jesus. Is then feeling, on top of whatever the original feeling was, is also now feeling guilty for not feeling close to Jesus or not being close to Jesus. I wonder how much of that theology that leaks into our daily conversations about faith comes from that notion of the vending machine God.
Oh.
Right?
Right.
If I were praying correctly, if I were doing this correctly, then God would reward me by doing X, Y, Z. Right? So if I'm not receiving X, Y, Z, then I'm not doing this thing correctly, which is a perfectly logical, conditional, but the premises are all wrong. Right?
Right.
Suppose instead we think about a situation like that, and we've talked about this, where if one is going through a tough time and God feels far away or I feel away from God, recognizing that Jesus, or however you conceive of God, is in that with me, is right next to me, is so close, like a shadow, that I don't spend time thinking about my shadow.
Right.
It's so close to me like a shadow, helping, doing, coaxing, supporting. Because when you're feeling cruddy, knowing that God is very, very close can be helpful. If I'm seeing God's hand in something I'm doing, even if I'm not, but it's easier if I am, and I am not feeling supported by God or something, it seems like something that might help me would be to spend some time every day focusing on that,
Yeah.
putting something on my mirror, something to make me aware that God is with me.
Well, and that kind of goes back to those lifestyle kinds of questions.
Okay.
It's like on the cosmic balance of things, these are not equally important, okay? But are you getting enough fruit in your diet?
Right.
And are you thinking about the blessings in your life?
Right.
Those are two practices that both contribute to your overall health, right?
Right.
If you can put those things on a similar plane for people, again, taking out the added weight of shame and should, then it just becomes another of your lifestyle choices that contribute to a healthier lifestyle. So part of a healthy lifestyle for a Christ follower is what you're talking about, is thinking on the things that you've been blessed with, is paying attention to the things that God is doing, reminding yourself.
Right.
Just like in the midst of this move, I know 100 times a day you reminded yourself, God is in this. This is something God is going to bless and is already blessing. So reminding yourself of those things when we get stuck in the feelings or the details or the minutia or whatever it is that pull us down, reminding ourselves of those things. Sometimes it's simple, like counting your blessings. If it's just a habit, if it's something that you build into your life, then it can help combat some of the things that cause us to go down rabbit holes and places where our minds want to go.
Right.
And again, it's not that it makes you a terrible person if you don't count your blessings.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that it makes you a holy person if you do.
Right.
But it contributes to a healthy mindset.
Yes.
And a healthy overall being when you do that.
Yes.
I'm sitting on the edge of your world. I'm watching you waiting to gather your nerve. There's nothing to say, you don't have to explain the heart that I already heard. I'm still on the edge of your world.
So what I'm hearing in response to someone who would condemn the young pastor, or who would be worried that his own depression was an expression of God's disfavor, or would should herself into a hole. What I'm hearing is helping that person by focusing on the fact that God companions us, that God is truly with us, truly in this with us, and that we can lean on that knowledge for support, even on those days when we don't feel it.
Yeah.
Setting our minds on things above rather than things of the earth is part of being healthy.
It is.
As a spiritual, complicated being.
Yes.
So, eating fruit, getting some exercise, getting your vitamin D from the sun, making sure that you spend some time with somebody who makes you laugh, pondering the closeness of God. These are all parts of the same thing.
Yes.
But that idea that when we feel bad or when we are stressed, we're just really not getting enough prayer time in that blamey way. I mean, it may be that I don't have enough prayer time and I need more prayer time for me.
Right.
Right. It's not for God.
Right.
But in that blamey way, it's just nonsense.
That just goes to a very small view of God, that God is petty and God is counting the minutes that we pray or don't pray. It just goes to a very, very small view of the Almighty to do that.
So what I'm hearing us say is feelings are clues, not cues. That making the effort to have daily practices of all kinds that touch the 6 aspects of the personality of the person. Reaching out to friends and other supports, including doctors, including therapists, including whatever. Recognizing that stress is not tied to salvation.
Right.
Yeah, I'm hearing that those are kinds of the things that we can do. And remembering that God companions us, that God is not petty, God is not small, and God is not a vending machine.
Exactly.
Okay.
One thing that I would say to our listeners is if you do have suicidal thoughts, if you do struggle with crippling anxiety or have trouble getting up out of bed in the morning because of just debilitating depression, there are resources, and we'll be happy to post some of those resources. Just go to our Facebook page. School for Seekers is where we are.
When one is, and going back to depression, when one is seriously depressed, reaching out is not possible.
Right.
So I want to encourage all of the folks who are listening who do not suffer from depression, do not suffer from crippling anxiety, to pay attention to the people around them and to do some of that reaching out. Because looking back and saying, why didn't he just say something? Well, because he wasn't capable of saying something.
Yeah.
When you're in the midst of that, there's nothing you can do. So pay attention. Don't be shy to say, hey, I've noticed you are darker than usual, or whatever the thing, whatever makes sense. Give that person an opening.
Yeah, that's good.
Anything else?
Find us. We are on all the socials, and we will be back in the habit of posting regular episodes, so you can look forward to that.
If you're not on our mailing list, you can get on our mailing list from our School for Seekers Facebook page. And I encourage you to do that because there are lots of just structural changes that are happening, and the ways we're operating are changing. So I would hate for our listeners to miss out on that stuff.
Yeah.
So please, please, please get on our mailing
Yeah,
list.
get on the mailing list.
Yep.
For sure.
I need more coffee, man.
I need way more coffee.
Okay.
All right. Thanks for listening. We appreciate y'all. Hey, and let us know what you want us to talk about. If you have ideas, if you have questions or things that you would just love to hear us natter about, please put them on our Facebook page in comments or send us a note. You can email us, Elane at School for Seekers, Benton at School for Seekers, and we'll be glad to look at those questions because we're always looking for stuff to talk about.
Because, we run out of things to talk about.
Yeah, we really don't talk when the mics when the mics aren't on.
Okay, so when the lightning bolt strikes us for the lie. All right, everybody.
All right, bye.
Bye.